Every overview tells you the same thing about the Imperial Fists: fortress builders, siege masters, defenders of Terra. All true, but in approximately 007.M31, during the opening years of the Horus Heresy, a captain named Alexis Polux took a fleet of roughly 363 warships into the Phall System and outmaneuvered the Iron Warriors Primarch Perturabo so thoroughly in void combat that lore veterans still debate how Perturabo let it happen. Not a siege, not a fortress wall, void combat, and almost no overview ever mentions it. That's not an accident. Every Space Marine Legion has been reduced to a single identity trait, and every one of those reductions buries something more interesting underneath. They like machines. They care about civilians. They became chaos berserkers. All technically true, all incomplete. Whether you've been reading this lore for 20 years or you're still figuring out who the Primarchs are, what follows isn't the first layer. It's the one underneath it. 18 legions, one buried truth each. Imperial Fists, the Void Masters. The Imperial Fists Fortress Monastery isn't on a planet. It's the Phalanx, a mobile star fort described as the largest vessel the Imperium commands, operational for 10,000 years by the setting's present day. A legion that lives permanently aboard a warship, whose finest officers held the dedicated title of Fleet Master, isn't a legion whose identity ends at planetary defense. Their void doctrine and siege doctrine were never separate philosophies. Both applied the same principle: find the weakest point, concentrate force there, and hold until the target breaks. The Imperial Fists maintained formalized boarding action capabilities as a core element of their doctrine, selecting warriors specifically for skill in void warfare and treating it as a distinct and honored specialization. Their void-hardened armor designation wasn't a battlefield modification. It was a recognized equipment class, which means the void wasn't an occasional feeder. It was a standing commitment. The Battle of Phall is confirmed as one of the largest void engagements of the entire Horus Heresy. Perturabo brought the Iron Warriors fleet to trap Pollux's Retribution fleet in the Phall System using what appeared to be a warp storm. Pollux suspected immediately the storm wasn't natural, a deliberate snare, and refused his crew's instinct to flee through it. Rather than spending ships on the storm's edges, he turned the tactical situation around entirely. The Iron Warriors' own formation created openings the Imperial Fists exploited, and the engagement that was supposed to be a quick execution of a trapped fleet became a brutal, grinding void battle. The Iron Warriors' Grand Cruiser Calamus was destroyed. Perturabo, who had broken fortified worlds across the galaxy and was regarded as one of the finest military minds of the Great Crusade, found himself tactically surprised by a captain who shouldn't have been able to fight back at all. The battle is officially recorded as a draw. Pollux was ordered to retreat by Terra before a decisive conclusion. That order is what saved the Iron Warriors from a worse outcome. Pollux survived the heresy and became the first chapter master of the Crimson Fists, one of the two founding successor chapters of the Imperial Fists. The other was the Black Templars, founded by Sigismund, Dorn's first captain and the finest duelist the heresy produced. Pollux died approximately 800 years later, killed by a poison projectile from a Scythian warrior monk during a massed assault. His entire career traces a thread of void warfare mastery that almost no introductory overview follows past Phall. The siege identity is real. The void identity is equally real. One doctrine, two theaters. The War Master, Sons of Horus. Before the Horus Heresy, the 16th Legion was called the Luna Wolves. Their Primarch, Horus Lupercal, was the first son of the Emperor to be rediscovered, the first to lead his legion on crusade, and the only Primarch trusted with the title War Master, supreme military commander over all other legions and Primarchs combined. Not because the Emperor lacked other options, because Horus was genuinely the best. The standard summary positions the Sons of Horus as the engine of the heresy, the legion that turned traitor and pulled a third of the Imperium with them. That's accurate. What it understates is the scale of what was lost. The Luna Wolves didn't receive their new name from the Emperor. They chose it. Warriors renaming their entire legion after their Primarch, voluntarily, because that was what he meant to them. Horus's corruption wasn't a defection or an ideological disagreement. It was engineered. A wound sustained on the world of Davin was manipulated through warp sorcery specifically to break him, to turn the Emperor's best military asset into the instrument of the Imperium's destruction. Chaos targeted Horus precisely because he was the greatest threat to it. A loyal war master leading the Great Crusade to completion was a future chaos needed to prevent. So they spent years constructing the conditions, manipulating the people around him, and exploiting the specific vulnerability that a near-fatal wound provided. It took that much deliberate engineering to break the best man the Emperor had. The tragedy of the Sons of Horus isn't that a powerful man chose evil. It's that producing what Horus became required a heresy-scale effort, because nothing simpler would have worked. The Architect, Word-bearers. Every other traitor legion was manipulated, deceived, or broken into betrayal. Horus was corrupted through a wound at Davin. Magnus used forbidden knowledge to send a genuine warning and was punished as a traitor for it. Angron arrived to his legion already being destroyed from inside his own skull by implants he hadn't chosen. Lorgar sought chaos out, deliberately, over decades. The Emperor destroyed a city the Word-bearers had built in his honor on the planet Kur, publicly humiliated Lorgar, ordered his legion to never worship him as a god, stripped away the entire foundation of meaning that had driven their crusade. Afterward, the Word-bearers performed compliance with imperial orders for over 40 years, while secretly laying the infrastructure of betrayal across the galaxy. Agents placed inside other legions' warrior lodges. Corruption seeded where it would be hardest to trace. The entire Horus Heresy, including Horus's own fall, traces back to Word-bearers' groundwork. Lorgar is arguably more responsible for it than Horus himself, and he's the one who almost never gets named when someone asks who started the war. The Executioners, Space Wolves. Space Wolves are remembered as ferocious packfighters with lupine instinct and a well-documented anti-authoritarian streak. Their original legion designation was the Rout, what the standard overview reliably undersells. They were the Emperor's sanctioned instrument of accountability against his own sons. When Primarchs stepped too far outside Imperial edicts, the Space Wolves went in. The burning of Prospero, the destruction of Magnus the Red's homeworld, and the obliteration of the Thousand Suns as they then existed, wasn't an improvised military decision. Leman Russ executed it on the Emperor's direct order. The Space Wolves were berserkers, yes. They were also the mechanism by which the Emperor enforced order on beings who otherwise answered to no one. Some Space Wolves eventually transform into Wolfen, wolf-beast mutations, a genetic curse that turns warriors into monsters. The Emperor's executioners, with their own monster lurking in the bloodline. The irony is structural. The secret, Dark Angels. The Dark Angels' post-heresy mission, hunting the fallen, former Dark Angels scattered across time and space after a civil war destroyed their homeworld Caliban, is the part everyone knows. What receives less attention is the ambiguity surrounding Lion L. Johnson's conduct during the heresy itself. He arrived at Terra after the worst fighting had already concluded. The questions about what the Lion knew during the war, what he was doing during those critical years, and whether his late arrival was circumstantial or deliberate have never been resolved in canon. Lion L. Johnson woke in the 41st millennium from a millennia-long healing sleep in the wreckage of Caliban they now call the Rock. He's back. Those unanswered questions came back with him. The Void Riders, White Scars. The White Scars are famous cavalry. Jagatai Khan built a legion around the principle that speed is a weapon, and the standard overview stops there. Bikes, fast vehicles, hit-and-run ground assaults. What it skips is that the White Scars applied speed doctrine to void combat with equal discipline. During the Horus Heresy, they conducted guerrilla operations against traitor supply lines deep in space, striking fast and vanishing before a response could form. The same logic as their ground tactics translated directly to the void between stars. Jaghatai Khan's final fate is the most fitting possible end for a Primarch defined by mobility. He disappeared in approximately 084.M31, entering the webway in pursuit of Dark Eldar raiders and never definitively returning. The fastest Primarch walked through a door most of his brothers never tried to open. The Grief, Iron Hands. Ferrus Manus was beheaded by Fulgrim at the Drop Site Massacre on Isstvan V. His head was taken as a trophy. The Iron Hands watched their Primarch die while fighting to survive the same ambush, and the philosophy they built afterward holds that flesh is weak, that flesh is fallible, that replacing biological tissue with metal brings a warrior closer to something incorruptible. Ferrus Manus didn't teach that. His famous silver arms were naturally occurring metal flesh, not implants, not ideology, just the way he was born. He was the Legion's engineer and craftsman, not a man who despised biological existence. The Iron Hands' defining creed, the one they've practiced for 10,000 years, replacing limbs and organs with augmetics as an act of faith, is a grief response misread as doctrine. A legion that has been mourning since Isstvan V and called the mourning a philosophy. The tragedy isn't what they became. It's that they've spent 10 millennia becoming it in the name of a Primarch who never asked them to. The used Iron Warriors. The Iron Warriors were given every assignment the Great Crusade needed done, but didn't celebrate. Every grinding siege of a fortified world that would consume years and thousands of lives. Every campaign that cleared the path for other legions to claim the glory. While the Imperial Fists received recognition for their defensive genius and held the Emperor's personal trust, the Iron Warriors built the Empire's infrastructure in blood and were treated as expendable for it. Perturabo eventually imposed a decimation on his own legion, executing 1 in 10 of his warriors as punishment for a defeat. By the time the heresy began, the Iron Warriors were a legion worn down by thankless assignments, stripped of recognition, and led by a Primarch who had started taking his frustration out on the people fighting under his command. Their allegiance to Horus wasn't sudden. The Imperium produced it gradually, the way anything breaks under sustained, unacknowledged pressure. 2 siege legions, roughly parallel doctrines. One celebrated, one assigned the worst jobs and forgotten until the bill came due. The Warhounds, World Eaters. Before Angron and the Butcher's Nails, the 12th Legion was called the Warhounds. Disciplined, effective. The neural implants that drive World Eaters into uncontrollable berserker fury were already in Angron's skull when the Emperor found him. Placed there by slavers who had forced him into gladiatorial combat on his homeworld of Nuceria. He arrived to his legion already being slowly destroyed from inside his own mind. He eventually imposed the nails on his warriors. Whether that decision was made by a man still capable of coherent thought, or by someone whose own implants had already begun consuming what he was, the lore doesn't settle cleanly. What it implies is darker. A Primarch passing his own destruction to the next generation not out of deliberate malice, but because he was already too far gone to know another option existed. The Chosen, Emperor's Children. The Emperor granted the Emperor's children something he gave no other legion, the right to bear his personal symbol, the Imperial Aquila, on their armor. They earned it through sheer excellence in the earliest years of the Great Crusade. So exemplary in execution, so faithful to the ideal of what a Space Marine was supposed to be, that the Emperor made them his chosen sons in the most literal sense available to him. Their descent didn't begin with corruption. It began with that same drive for perfection becoming a standard nothing could satisfy. The fall of the Emperor's children traces a terrible internal logic. They were granted the highest possible recognition, then defined themselves against it, until the gap between what they were and what they aspired to be became unbridgeable. Fulgrim's eventual possession accelerated what the philosophy had already set in motion. Their chaos devotion makes more sense as the conclusion to a specific creed than as a random corruption. The fall from the highest possible grace made the fall longer than anyone else's. The unwilling immortals, Death Guard. Before Nurgle, before Rot, the 14th Legion was called the Dusk Raiders. Their identity wasn't plague, it was endurance. They won campaigns by surviving everything the enemy deployed and continuing to advance when other legions would have pulled back. Toughest unit in a war of extraordinarily tough units. Mortarion's personal history is the foreshadowing. He grew up on the plague world Barbarous, under a sorcerer foster father who subjected him to constant alchemical poisons. And Mortarion spent his entire childhood systematically building immunity to each one. He arrived to the Great Crusade as a man who had already proven that endurance without end was achievable. Nurgle didn't find a weak target. He found the one Primarch whose entire identity, since before the Emperor ever discovered him, was built around surviving everything that should have killed him. Then offered him the logical conclusion of that philosophy as a gift. The warning, Thousand Sons. Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons lived under a verdict before the heresy even started. Their psychic gifts were so extreme and so poorly controlled in the Legion's early years that the Emperor convened the Council of Nicaea specifically to adjudicate whether they could continue using psychic powers at all. Nicaea ruled against them. What most summaries undersell, Magnus didn't shatter the Emperor's psychic wards on Terra out of arrogance. He did it to warn the Emperor that Horus had turned traitor. The warning was accurate. The method destroyed years of work on the Emperor's secret Webway project and collapsed the wards protecting it. As punishment, the Emperor ordered the Space Wolves to burn Prospero. The 1,000 Sons paid the price for loyalty executed the wrong way, a tragedy made worse by the fact that the information they died delivering was true and the Imperium genuinely needed it. The Judge, Night Lords. Conrad Kurz received precognitive visions from childhood, dark, specific, and relentless. He used them to pacify Nostromo through terror and the systematic execution of anyone his visions identified as future criminals. Crime on Nostromo dropped to 0. His methods worked. The Emperor condemned him when measured against Primarchs who had governed easier worlds with gentler approaches. The philosophical argument Kurz made, that his results were real, that fear was simply a more honest tool than the ones other Primarchs used, is something the Lord never quite dismisses. At the end, he allowed himself to be killed by an Imperial assassin, having foreseen exactly how and when it would happen. The parallel to Sanguinius, both Primarchs who saw their deaths coming and walked toward them anyway, is one of the most quietly devastating structural mirrors in the entire heresy. Two men who accepted their ends consciously, one celebrated for it, one condemned. The Ghost, Ravengard. Corvus Corax lost roughly 80% of his legion at the drop site massacre on Istvan V. What he did to rebuild is discussed far less than the loss itself. The Emperor granted him access to forbidden accelerated Primarch genetic material, and Corax attempted to rapidly reconstruct his forces with it. The experiments produced failures, proto-Space Marines that came out wrong, broken, monstrous. He executed what he created. He released into the wilderness the ones he couldn't bring himself to kill, then disappeared into the Eye of Terror to hunt the traitor legions responsible for what had been done to his sons. His final recorded word was nevermore. A Primarch who began the heresy as a liberator, he had freed his own people from slavery before the Emperor ever found him, ended it having done things he could never undo, and walked into the warp rather than back to the Imperium he'd spent his life defending. The Empire, Ultramarines. The Ultramarines were the largest legion in the heresy by a significant margin, 250,000 warriors at the war's start, against 150,000 to 180,000 Iron Warriors, at the next closest figure. Rabute Guilliman wasn't only fighting during the heresy, he was building. The 500 worlds of Ultramar expanded substantially during the conflict, and the scale of what he was constructing prompted other Primarchs to accuse him of positioning himself to replace the Emperor if Terra fell. Whether that accusation was fair, or a misread of a man simply doing his job better than everyone else, is a debate the lore keeps deliberately open. Guilliman post-heresy wrote the Codex Astartes and restructured the entire Space Marine organization. The man accused of empire building ended up literally designing the institution that replaced the legions. Every Space Marine chapter existing today exists because of decisions he made when nobody else was organizing the aftermath. Vulcan, the Salamanders. Nocturne is a world that doesn't forgive mistakes. Continuous seismic activity, toxic atmosphere, volcanoes that reshape the terrain often enough that permanent settlements are impossible. The people of Nocturne build, lose everything to the planet, and build again. Vulcan grew up among them. Before the Emperor found him, he was a blacksmith. Most overviews mention that and move immediately past it. The Salamander's entire second identity lives in that detail. Their doctrine, called the Promethean cult, a sanctioned variation of the Imperial cult, emphasized self-reliance, loyalty, patience, self-sacrifice, and endurance. Not worship of the Emperor as a distant divine authority, but devotion to the qualities he embodied. A philosophy that looks inward rather than upward. Every Salamander is expected to create their own weapons and armor with their own hands, tracing a direct line from Vulcan's blacksmith origin to every artificer suit and master-crafted weapon the Legion has ever fielded. The Forge Father title carried by Vulcan Histan encodes the entire identity, not Battle Father, not War Leader, Forge Father. Their care for civilian populations is real. It isn't sentimentality. On Nocturne, you understand viscerally what it means to lose everything to forces beyond your control, and you understand that rebuilding anyway isn't optional. It's just what you do. Vulcan didn't know he was immortal. That fact changes how every part of his story reads. When the drop site massacre on Istvan V collapsed into slaughter, he died in a nuclear strike. Then he came back. Vulcan is a perpetual, one of a rare category of human beings capable of regenerating from any death, including, as canon confirms, complete molecular disintegration. But this ability was initially unknown even to him. The first time he died and woke in the ruins of the massacre, he had no framework for understanding it. He just found himself alive in a situation that should have ended him. Conrad Kurz captured him afterward. For several solar months, Vulcan was held aboard a Night Lord's prison hulk while Kurz tested what his body could survive. The documented methods include beheading, throat rupture, limb dismemberment by claws, close-range simultaneous execution by hundreds of weapons, placement in engine ventilation shafts, and expulsion through airlocks into open space. Vulcan died repeatedly. He came back each time. Kurz watched each return. What Kurz actually wanted wasn't pain for its own sake. He wanted proof that Vulcan's morality was contingent, that any person, given sufficient suffering, would become what Kurz was. Kurz had lived his entire life in the grip of terrible visions, made choices others condemned, and fundamentally couldn't accept that Vulcan's compassion was character rather than circumstance. He wanted one of the Emperor's best men to break under enough pressure, because if Vulcan broke, Kurz's own choices could be explained as the inevitable result of an impossible situation rather than a failure of will. Vulcan didn't break. After several solar months, he escaped before Kurz was himself captured by Lionel Johnson, a man who died an unknown number of times in that ship. Without certainty, he would keep coming back, endured it without becoming something else. He walked away, still believing what he'd believed before Istvan V. Vulcan led the Salamanders for approximately 3 centuries after the heresy. Then he disappeared, telling his sons he would return in the end times. Their prophetic text, the Tome of Fire, predicts his return tied to 9 artifacts the Legion has spent thousands of years recovering. He was confirmed still active roughly 1,500 years post-heresy during the War of the Beast. What happened to him after that conflict is genuinely unresolved. The canon trail effectively ends there. The Tome of Fire says he comes back. The Salamanders are still looking. Sanguinius, the Blood Angels. Sanguinius is described as the most beautiful of the Primarchs, a warrior of devastating capability, a leader who inspired genuine devotion in his sons and his brothers both. All documented, all the surface. The hidden depth isn't his capabilities or his character, it's what he knew. Sanguinius foresaw his own death at Horus's hands, not a vague premonition, specifically. His precognitive visions showed him the outcome in detail, and canon confirms he recognized these visions would prove accurate the same way all his others had. He shared what he'd seen with his brothers before the siege of Terra. He knew what waited for him aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and he boarded it anyway. By the time Sanguinius reached that confrontation, he had fought for months in the siege of Terra. He had killed the greater demon Kabanda. He had led Blood Angels through some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. None of it changed what he already knew was at the end of the path. He walked toward it, carrying that knowledge alongside everything else. Horus killed him. The Emperor arrived and found Sanguinius already fallen, tossed aside. Imperial legend, and the lore is precise about calling it legend, holds that wounds Sanguinius dealt Horus in their final fight created the opening the Emperor needed to destroy the War Master. Whether that's true, or a story the Blood Angels tell to give his death meaning, has never been confirmed as hard fact. The Blood Angels maintain it as an article of faith, that he knew, that he chose it, that it mattered. What isn't legend is the Black Rage. Sanguinius's death left a permanent psychic mark inside every one of his sons, a flaw that persists 10,000 years later. In battle, it can overwhelm a Blood Angel completely. Warriors taken by the Black Rage relive Sanguinius's final moments. They believe they are Sanguinius dying. They experience what he felt at the moment Horus killed him, replayed in full, transmitted across 100 centuries of sons who never met him. Blood Angels consumed by the Black Rage are deployed in the Death Company, sent where the fighting is heaviest, given the chance to spend that inherited fury against enemies before they meet their own end. A legion still processing their Primarch's death after 10,000 years, still reliving it, still carrying it into every battle they fight. The second identity here isn't a capability, it's what it means that he knew and chose it, and left his sons living the last thing he ever felt, forever. Alpharius, the Alpha Legion. The Alpha Legion is the 20th Legion. Their Primarch is Alpharius, except their Primarch is also Omegon, identical twins, physically indistinguishable, jointly commanding a single legion in a secret the wider Imperium never discovered. During the Horus Heresy, the doctrine was legion-wide. Any Alpha Legionnaire, asked their name by an outside party, gave one answer: I am Alpharius. The entire legion adopted the Primarch's identity. Nobody could confirm anything about anyone. The meme has a lore basis. It was real doctrine. What reframes their entire heresy arc is the Cabal, an ancient Xenos organization dedicated to the eventual destruction of chaos, which approached Alpharius and Omegon and presented 2 possible futures. In the first, the Alpha Legion stays loyal, the Emperor wins, but chaos survives and corrupts the Imperium gradually over the following millennia regardless. In the second, the Alpha Legion joins Horus. Horus wins. The aftermath destroys both sides, and chaos, starved of the sustained conflict that feeds it, eventually dies. The Cabal's plan, stated explicitly in Dan Abnett's Legion, was to push the Alpha Legion toward Horus so that the ensuing mutual destruction would eliminate the ruinous powers permanently. Alpharius chose the second future. The Alpha Legion's apparent betrayal was calculated sacrifice. They traded their souls and their reputation for what they believed was the only path to actually killing chaos for good. The Cabal's projections were wrong. The plan failed. The aftermath didn't produce the outcome they predicted, but the Alpha Legion entered the heresy believing they were making the most selfless choice any legion had ever made. One more thing most summaries skip entirely. According to the Primarchs novel series, Alfarius was actually the first Primarch discovered by the Emperor, found years before Horus, and spent decades operating undercover on Terra before his existence was acknowledged. The last legion numerically was the first found personally. The most secretive Primarch was the most deeply embedded in the Imperium's own infrastructure from the start. Alfarius was killed by Rogel Dorn at the Battle of Pluto, confirmed in John French's Praetorian of Dorn and later acknowledged within the narrative by Omegon himself. Dorn denied Alfarius any acknowledgement or honor in death. Far away, Omegon sensed his twin die and went distant. Whether Omegon continued some version of the long game afterward, whether the Alpha Legion, scattered and leaderless, are still executing a plan nobody else can read, remains deliberately unresolved. Drop "I am Alfarius" in the comments if any of that sounds familiar. I want to see how many of you are out there. The Forgotten and the Purged, 2nd and 11th Legion. The Emperor created 20 Primarchs. 18 are known, 2 aren't. The 2nd and 11th Legions and their Primarchs were expunged from Imperial records during the Great Crusade itself, before the Horus Heresy, before the Dropsite Massacre, while the Emperor still walked among his sons and personally commanded armies. By the time the heresy began, their absence was simply accepted. The other Primarchs, even those who would later turn traitor, appear to have remembered the lost too, not with hatred, but with grief. Robude Gilliman, in one surviving reference, described them as having failed, not rebelled, not betrayed. Failed. That specific word has unsettled people for a long time. The formal imperial mechanism is called an edict of obliteration. In High Gothic, damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. The two legions are referred to in what passing references survive as the Forgotten and the Purged. Their names were deleted from every record. Their thousands of warriors vanished from imperial rosters, with some accounts suggesting survivors were absorbed quietly into the Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, their origins erased without trace. The most visible in-universe evidence that they existed at all is 2 skulls, marked 2 and 11, on Malcador the Sigillite's throne. Dan Abnett's novel Penitent contains what might be the most honest assessment in all of canon about what can actually be known. A character observes that of the 2 missing Primarchs, nothing at all was known, not even their names, to be spat on and damned. Not their names. The erasure was thorough enough that even condemning them became impossible. You can't curse a name that doesn't exist. The Emperor wiped them so completely that Primarchs who had known them personally apparently couldn't access their names. The deliberate ambiguity is baked into the in-universe record and into the real-world design simultaneously. Aaron Dembski-Bowden confirmed there is explicitly not allowed to be an answer to this mystery. Rick Priestley, co-creator of Warhammer 40,000, built the gaps intentionally from the beginning. Both the Edict of Obliteration and the authorial decision point to the same conclusion. Some things are gone and don't come back. What makes the erasure genuinely unsettling is the comparison. The Word-Bearers committed citywide massacres during the Great Crusade. The Night Lords conducted terror campaigns against civilian populations for decades. The World Eaters were already implanting torture devices in their own warriors' skulls. None of them were expunged. Whatever the 2nd and 11th did was categorically different. Worse than documented atrocity, worse than religious extremism, worse than anything the traitor legions did openly during the Crusade years. The Emperor erased them at the height of his power, when he had every reason to make examples rather than create mysteries. That means whatever they did, public knowledge of it was more dangerous than the silence. 3 explanations exist in canon. They rebelled and were crushed early, but the grief in surviving references argues against a simple armed revolt. They discovered something the Emperor couldn't permit to be shared, some truth about the warp, or about what the Great Crusade was actually building toward. Or their Primarchs template produced a catastrophic genetic flaw that made the Legion an unmanageable danger. In James Swallow's Fear to Tread, Sanguinius says he won't reveal his Legion's flaw because he won't have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as his Legion's only memorial. The implication is direct enough. If you've started seriously wondering what they could have done, some knowledge attracts attention from parties you'd rather not encounter. There are chapters of Space Marines specifically created to manage exactly what you might find if you kept pulling at this thread. They operate in complete secrecy. They wear gray. And I think we should leave it exactly there before this video attracts the wrong kind of... Subscribe for more stories like this. Every Legion goes deeper. This was just the layer underneath the surface.